All right, folks, we're going to get started. I just want to let you know that we've got everybody muted. If you could put your questions, if you have any questions during the WebEx, put them in the chat to the presenters or the notes to the presenters, and we'll collect those for the end of the WebEx and then go through them at that point. I also want to let you know that we are recording this WebEx so that you can reference it later and pass it around and have it available to you. Also, we'll include the contacts will be embedded within the slides. And so we might as well get started. All right, so the folks involved from Tresys, I'm Charlie Zaloom, VP of the Commercial Sector, and I've got Francisco Slavin, who's going to help us out. He's he's a security architect that's been applied to commercial sector. You'll find him very knowledgeable in this topic. And Donna Brooks is the account manager that covers this sector also. Who we are, you guys know us pretty well. We've been, involved with NITSL and NEI, and been talking to the industry for quite some time. Outside of PowerGen, we're recognized as a leader in operating system security, hardening systems. We were on the development team for SE Linux Security Enhanced Linux, which is shipped with Red Hat. We've worked with Samsung and Cisco and quite a few other companies in developing secure products and platforms. We produce 5 product lines. The one that we're going to be addressing today is the XD Air, the portable media device scanner. We have 2 diodes, one that's for domestic use and one we can export. The government doesn't, it's a munition. The XD bridge is a munition, can't be exported without waiver. So we developed a exportable version, Guardian, XD Guardian. And then we have a sidecar, which is similar to XD Air, but a network version. So it does deep content inspection for as part of the diode. It's a sidecar device to a diode. And then our third major product is, or product family, is Mobile Fortress, which is a secure Android tablet or phone, which is very high assurance. It's an extension of basically your enterprise or your embedded devices into the mobile space. So today's topic is securing supply chain data distribution. And normally this comes under portable media device protection or guidance and compliance. But one of the things that we've studied, if you see this progression that we had, we were studying the data flows of information into controlled areas, level 3 and 4 and such, and came up with several facts that you are very familiar with in your daily work. Most of the inflows are from few vendors, so relatively few. 4 or 5 is what we find, roughly, a handful, are the majority of the volume of files and information that have to be moved into the controlled areas. There's some exceptions, but they're usually infrequent. So there's regular, if you can assume that only a few vendors, the turbines, the security folks, and updates like that are the majority of it. They're pretty regular and they're pretty similar formats. So we associate this then, being outsiders and then learning this over the past 3 years, that portable media device protection is related to a secure supply chain function. So it's a bit bigger topic than just portable media security. So back to the transfer process and back to, as a component of supply chain, portable media device transfer process can be broken down into 3 families or methods. The first is known good. That's what one of our unique strengths in the product. We basically have a structured approach to handling different formats and we pass only files that can be made and brought to a known good state. The second is known bad. That's looking for properties through behavioral analysis and heuristics against tables of past vulnerabilities or perceived future vulnerabilities. And then the third is known source, where you basically don't analyze and you sign and seal with a hash the file straight from the vendor, so that the extension of trust, if you will, and the integrity is extended up to the vendor, and it comes from the vendor and it can't be changed. So you're hoping that the vendor has got a secure process and procedures, SQA, and so forth. On top of this, two things that are necessary is that you should have all of the protection of the scanning device, the scanning application or the scanning engine must be protected from the bottom. The system itself has to be, the scanner itself has to be on a hardened platform as a border device to be protected, to protect its function. The other property is that we need to protect against the threats from the media itself, the hardware and firmware. So I'm going to turn it over now to the smarter guy in the room. Francisco here has basically put together an approach, the approach that we're taking toward employing all three of those families of security methods or processes to secure the supply chain in a transitive fashion, so that you can take what you're doing now, make it functional, and move into future process and procedures that will control your portable media device transfers. So, Francisco?
Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate the introduction. So, I'm going to cover today the basics. We'll just look at a simple picture of portable media protection and the workflow for that everyone should be familiar with. We'll talk through the scope and the depth of what this sort of protection means, sort of the breadth and the depth of how we approach security and how we're approaching this problem of doing supply chain data distribution with portable media. We'll touch briefly on integration. Integration could take up a whole extra session, really. And a lot of those details are site-specific. From one site to the next, there's some tailoring that gets done. So integration we'll touch briefly on today. Supply chain is really where we're getting to. And that's going to talk through the workflow and how we perceive the workflow changing and developing going forward to provide better security and better assurance as part of that data distribution. And then we'll wrap up. And as Charlie mentioned, we'll take the questions at the end, anything that's been submitted through the chat, and we can open up the line. People can put their hands up using the little WebEx feature. And if anybody wants to get on the line and ask questions at the end, we'll provide that capability as well. So looking at this basic picture, if you have no portable media security, just a worst case scenario, then anything that could get corrupted at the vendor facility or in transit to your facility or within your facility through other means can end up making its way into that secure enclave, to those air gap systems, the systems that are supposed to be protected via the air gap as part of the SDA, the Secure Defensive Architecture. Because of that air gap per the SDA, the main primary attack vector for those systems is over portable media. That's where most of that data is getting brought in. And as Charlie said, most of the content that would get exposed to those systems are part of the supply chain data distribution, updates from vendors and the like. So with the boundary protection device, with an XD Air in place, you can enforce a procedure and say anything that's moving to these secure air gap systems must be passed through a boundary protection device. And at that point, even if some malicious content's gotten picked up on that device, either way back at the vendor facility, anywhere in transit while it's made its way to your facility, wherever earlier on in that process some malicious content could have gotten picked up, that can get scrubbed and sanitized, and you don't end up exposing the truly critical systems, the air gap protected systems, to those sort of threats from portable media. Now, while portable media is the primary threat vector for those air gap systems, it is still a threat vector for other systems in your facility. So as part of an added layer of security, you can add an XDR to the picture earlier on in the process and just say any portable media being brought into the facility, even if it's connecting to a corporate network or non-critical systems, must also be run through this sort of sanitization process. So there's an ability to take a layered defense approach, and the real critical defense, obviously, is for those true critical systems. Speaking of the scope and the breadth of threats that are available, especially considering the DBT, the design basis threat, a targeted threat must be considered. And one of the common methods used with targeted threat attacks, with design-based attacks, is the use of zero-day malware. One of the emerging threats from portable media, really the threat vector has been there a while, but it's picked up a lot of attention lately, is the sort of firmware threats such as bad USB, which was very highly publicized recently. So these sort of threats are there, and that presents a broader scope than the traditional view of looking at known bad content, something that can be verified with a signature from a virus scanner or detected with some heuristics or basic behavioral detection. So a conventional system that's only running AV scanning would not provide the sort of device protection or the sort of zero-day protection that's needed to address the modern scope of portable media threats. And I should nod and say that there's also some justification from the regulations that firmware has to be protected and that you have to protect against sort of emerging threats. That's part of the whole DBT, is that if there's a targeted threat to be considered, that threat must be presumed to use more sophisticated modern attack methods as opposed to the traditional sort of malware that's been seen in the field for a long time. We'll discuss some more of the advanced analytics a bit later, what Charlie talked about, the known good, and what I would call deep content inspection to be able to scrub out other types of malicious content. So I'll get into that in a bit more detail farther along in the presentation. When we consider the depth of protection, as I mentioned, the boundary protection devices are part of the regulation. And as part of the DBT, the boundary protection devices must be considered targets. They're part of what's threatened by this sort of a threat. We do have some extra documents that go into some more depth on this. I've attached them to the presentation. Charlie sent out links when he sent out the invites and the reminders for this that go into some more detail with the regs and that go into some actual specific language citation. So I won't belabor that and get into the full detail here. But regulation or not, even a common security concept requires you to consider boundary devices as part of the target. A boundary protection device is a security critical device. It performs an important security function, and if it's compromised, it presents a very, very high risk to the systems it's supposed to be protecting. The language, if I remember the quote quite right, is a boundary device must be protected at or above the level of the systems that it protects. And that's from regulation, and it's also a common security practice. If you're protecting against portable media threats with this boundary protection device, the device itself must be protected against all of those same threats. If you have a system that's not quite secure and it's not hardened against all of those threats, you end up with a very bad picture. The situation at that point, if you have a compromised device, like the one on the right here, any malicious content that can be coming in could be allowed to pass straight through to your secure systems. And at this point, it doesn't really matter what the source material was, what the vendor was providing you with. Anywhere in transit, some malware could have been picked up if that device got connected to a home computer or a local network at a different office. And at the same time, even if all of that content has made it through to your facility and all of that content's good and it's been verified, it hasn't been compromised, if your boundary protection device is non-secure, if it's been compromised, then all of that good content could simply be corrupted in transit over that boundary protection device. So bad content can still make it through and good content can be corrupted. Either way you go, you end up with a compromise to those secure systems if the boundary protection device itself has been compromised. With that in mind, it's important to consider self-protection, which is protecting the actual boundary protection device itself. So this is really a large part of our bread and butter going back historically before we got into doing the secure supply chain. This is something we've got a long history in, is securing these sort of systems for boundary protection. And you have to take a layered defense in-depth approach when you're providing this sort of protection. You need to be able to protect from that lowest level, make sure you have the core basic BIOS protections in place. You've used whatever security configuration you can at that level. You need to look at protection then at the kernel, at the operating system level. And you can strip out unnecessary drivers to reduce what we would call the trusted computing base, simply reducing the possible attack surface. For instance, if you are supporting portable media storage devices for scanning that content, you don't want to support any sort of webcam or any sort of human interface device that could also be hooked up over USB. Those sorts of things need to be considered, especially given the recent bad USB threats, where devices would disguise themselves as storage and then try to behave in unexpected ways to compromise a system. We've also got a long history in SE Linux, and all of our systems have very hardened SE Linux policy. This is mandatory access control policy, so this is a lower level than normal file permissions. This is kernel level protection for all of the normal access control that happens from one side of a system to another, from one process to another, between processes and different files and file systems that they would want to access. Part of using that SE Linux separation and part of doing that in a secure way involves input and output isolation. You want your filtering to be non-bypassable, which means that you don't want a corrupt input to be able to compromise the output and bypass the sort of filtering that you need to do, the content scanning, the antivirus scanning, everything else that you're doing. If there's a direct input-output pipe from one side to the other that can bypass that, then you can end up in a situation where all of that smart filtering and all of that smart AV checking that you're doing ends up not counting at the end of the day. One of the new things that XDR 4.5 is adding in is behavior-based alerts. This is another level of protection where instead of just stripping out drivers to prevent bad USB device compromises, we can actually put in alerts so those devices are not permitted to take any malicious action on the system, and a visible alert would come up for the user of the system. The transaction would be canceled and that information would be logged, so you can keep track of any sort of suspicious activity, any sort of potentially compromised devices that are being used on the system. Host integrity checking is a must if you're talking about self-protection. This includes just running AV on your system itself. It includes doing advanced intrusion detection. On Linux, you would use AID for this, and that's checking the hashes of all your files on a regular basis. This is part of the sort of newer continuous monitoring framework that people discuss, though these techniques and methods have been around for some time. So I know the slide looks a little bit busy. Really, this is a simplified picture of the level of depth that we go to when we provide this sort of self-protection. I mentioned that we would cover the integration portion briefly. Obviously, part of process and procedure involves having to actually use this system. If somebody can simply walk in with a drive, not plug it into the boundary protection device, and access the CDA, then you've got a bypass. So there has to be an overlap with the physical security, the process and procedure that are in place. There also has to be an important part of the logging, We support full forensic logging. You can log at a great level of detail every transaction that gets done using this device. Those logs need to be maintained, they need to be periodically reviewed, they need to be backed up for an acceptable amount of time. And as I mentioned with those behavior alerts, if something suspicious occurs, if there's a device that seems to be misbehaving, there needs to be a quarantine procedure in place so that you can keep those out of the normal circulation, keep those devices from affecting a CDA while they sit there and await deeper forensic analysis from an expert. And really what it comes down to is that these boundary protection devices, we're talking about portable media, but if you're talking about network boundary protection, a lot of these concepts apply as well. They are communication paths. We're talking about something that allows data to get from an outside source to a CDA, to a secure critical system. So that's always going to represent a communication path. Within that communication path, it's possible to manage the flow of data. And that's really the picture we're going to get to with securing supply chain data distribution. We want to manage the inflow, outflow, the ingress, egress of data. We want to be able to track that, log it, and analyze it on the fly to be able to deny any sort of malicious content. So getting into the supply chain part of the conversation, which is really the newer direction to look at this, is don't just protect against this, manage it in a deep way. Know what information is coming in, know what information is going out, and be able to take a really close look at that in an automated way to be able to provide a high level of assurance. Now, in an unmanaged data flow, everything's just unknown. Whatever data is out there can make it into your systems. You can have detection on your systems, so you may know that it's caught some malware, and you may be able to remove that malware. But in an unmanaged data flow, it's very, very difficult to then track back and have any sort of non-repudiation to be able to show that this is where this malicious firmware entered our facility. This is the path it took in getting to this system. As we move into a managed data flow, you can start gathering metrics on what files are being brought in. And you can look at this at a granular level, at file type, you can look at file size, you can gather any information on these files coming in. And when it comes to the flows that Charlie was talking about earlier, really our ideal from a security perspective is what we call known good. When I talk about filtering and when I talk about deep content inspection, that's really known good analysis. This is something where you have a defined file type, you know the specification, you know the exact desired format for that, and you can analyze it and determine where potential threats are. For instance, macros that ride along Word documents. That's the simplest example, but it's something everybody can relate to, and those can be stripped out in an automated fashion because of the known structure of those files. Now, this applies to many other file types as well, and we've got a data sheet that has a long list of the file types we currently support for known good, and with newer versions, we add new data types, and we do deeper analysis on more files. Now, for industrial systems, walking in the door, there are many vendor-specific files getting brought in. There are a lot of patches that are proprietary, that are in formats that those vendors have. So in those cases, there may not be existing known good filtering capabilities. That doesn't mean those filtering capabilities can't be developed, and with more time and with some focus and research and targeting the most important files to get brought in, it may be possible to perform some additional known good filtering and increase the assurance over time. However, to support the transition to managed data flows and to be able to get this working out of the gate, to work from day one, we provide known source capabilities. So if you know where these files are coming from, you know the vendor, that vendor can sign those files, they can share the public key part of their key pair with you, and you can load that into the XDR. And that way you have a signed file from the vendor, you can verify that signature when that file reaches you, and that way you know that file came from that vendor and it hasn't been changed in transit. Because once again, even if that file gets loaded on a portable media device at the vendor facility, the person carrying that may hook it up to their laptop, they may hook it up to their home computer while they're working with it. It may get used for something else, and the chance of that file being modified in transit means that by the time it reaches your facility, you may not have that assurance that it's the exact same file the vendor sent you. And using basic hashing can get you part of the way there, but using signing, which is combining the hash with a key pair, allows you to provide a high level of assurance that that file is the exact one the vendor meant to send to you. Now, not all vendors are currently supporting this. So again, walking in the door, this may not be a high percentage of the files that are being transferred. However, the goal is to move from the current capabilities towards a higher assurance target, so that as we get more vendor adaptation, and we are working with some vendors to push this workflow as well and to encourage this sort of best security practice, then we get to a point where at this target level, we can increase the amount of known good analysis, and we can increase the amount of known source, the amount of high integrity files being brought in from vendors. And I should also add that those known source files are still run through an AV scanner. So any sort of known bad content, if they had accidentally signed something that was easily detectable, that would still be detected as part of this analysis. These aren't just given a complete clear path to bypass the system. These are still scrutinized. And for other file types, security never gets fully to 100% of where we'd like in an ideal world. We still support AV scanning, and XDR 4.5 will have 2 levels of AV. That's part of customer requests that we've gotten in from industry. So we do provide an AV analysis path. And the goal is that if you have an AV-only station, you can really only move to AV scanning. If you have a more sophisticated station, then the AV becomes your backdrop. Those become your exceptions. Everything should be either known good or known source in an ideal world, and the other file types should be considered exceptions. And you can still run AV against those exceptions. You can still get yourself some protection there. But the idea is that that should be the lowest bar that you set. That shouldn't be the high bar that you reach for. The high bar should be known source and known good. Now, I've talked about known source a little bit already. I'll talk about the workflow for that very briefly. Again, this requires vendor buy-in and vendor support, but the vendor signs the file at their facility. Once it gets to you, you can verify that signature on the XDR unit, and you still have that forensic logging. So one of the problems with known source is that if a vendor signs something that's malicious, if they don't have the best secure, software QA, all the best practices going at their facility, they may still end up signing something that's malicious. We're still going to run AV against that as that bare minimum check to try to protect against these threats. But if they've signed something and what they've signed is a 0-day grade sort of threat, then you still have the forensic logging, so that once that gets detected and once you can figure that out from the rest of your continuous monitoring within the facility, you can be able to trace back through your logs because of that managed information flow and be able to determine what vendor signed that file and whether that file was changed while in your facility or whether the copy they gave you was bad when it walked in the door. So that's really one of the primary benefits as well, is that even if the most advanced analytics out there, if something still gets past that and gets detected farther along the line, you still have these logs to be able to trace back and try to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. And again, be able to talk to that vendor and have a serious conversation with them about how that sort of malicious content ended up getting signed in the first place. For those familiar, key management is usually the culprit. Key management's historically the problem. If they had let the key they use to sign files in their facility get used by somebody else, that could end up being used to corrupt that known source process. So there are always still threats, but with this managed information flow, we can provide the highest assurance out there against these threats and be able to provide the level of managed information flow to log all of the information coming in and out over these devices. Again, we'll have a bit of question and answer later for those of you who've had questions going along. At this point, I'm going to hand it back to Charlie to wrap things up.
Yeah, so you heard some of the, a high-level description of all of these details, and, you all may have additional questions in depth for each column practically in what we do, because what we're offering here is the only product that combines the three known methods for, protecting portable media devices, and additionally add the hardening at the platform level so that those processes are protected against both, internal and network capabilities or attacks from the payloads, but also from the hardware and firmware that are being introduced to the device. Those are threats on, and these are significant threats to other systems that are merely based on hardened, general purpose computing or computers or desktops. And so the intent here is to combine this hardened platform and the three processes to transition to a secure supply chain and secure data flow. We can work today with the processes and procedures that you're doing now. We have customers that are doing that in the nuclear industry, and we've worked out best practices to doing it. We've included a generic version of that. It's sort of generalized process and procedure outline. It's in the invitation, if you notice, along with the regulation highlights that Francisco put together. So the idea is that we can take you from the present to best practices today to future practices that are of a high level of assurance and quality that will allow you to be not only audited successfully, but have true and real protection. If you have any additional information, you guys, these are some of the PDFs. The top three, I believe, are on the in the invite. The bottom two are our general. You can participate in our blog, and then there are product sheets on the web too. Francisco, you have something?
Yep.
Okay, and then here's our contact information. So let me back up to the Q&A.
Yeah, we'll leave these links up there. Again, these should most of these should be out in the invites as well. And it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to take a moment to look over that, and we'll get to answering questions in just a minute.
No, I'm going to sing for everybody while we do that. I'm sure you're going to enjoy that. No, go ahead. Wow, good questions.
Okay. I had one comment about I may have dropped the wrong letter for the wrong appendix in my NEIO 809 reference. Oh. My mistake in that case. As I mentioned, some of the links that you see there are the full documents where we call out to regulation and we cite language specifically. So we've got the exact direct citations in all of those materials that are on the web.
That are correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Going through these.
And I had another comment that for the secure supply chain data distribution, the term from the regulation for that is also trusted distribution path.
Right.
So thank you for the comments. I appreciate the clarification on terminology for that. All right, and we had a question about links and URLs to technical documents, so that's on this slide right here for you.
And you can contact either of us. We have extensive documentation from our certifications that were performed on the product. This product is built to a very high level. It's still, after I think 3 or 4 years, the only product that is certified to sanitize documents that the government military at the classified level for taking documents in, sort of their supply chain. So it's still the only product and it is unique as the only product that sanitizes portable media.
And that's a good point, Charlie. We do have all of this information out there on the web, and for people who want a deeper dive, we do have a lot of really detailed documentation.
Yeah, and it's written in a very structured form for the certifications that we had to go through with the product years ago, and it's very useful, I think, to give a background and body of evidence for audit, and that's something we always provide for the audit events.
So we had a couple of questions about new features that are coming out in the newer version of XDR 4.5.
It actually says exciting new features, and there's very little exciting in portable media device protection, but there are some things coming on.
Yeah, so one of the ones that I mentioned earlier, and we do have another question about this as well, is multi-engine AV scanning.
Right.
So we do have multi-engine AV scanning coming in XDR 4.5. As one of our questions pointed out, that is coming up soon.
It's like 45 to 60 days, something like that.
Yeah.
And the reason why we're going to multiple engines is it's easier for us to comply with existing guidance rather than modify that guidance. So we're just adding it to the product. It originally had multiple AVs, and we removed them because we're not that, as Francisco said, it's a secondary protection. The primary protection, we want to use known source and known good.
Okay.
But we're adding it. We're adding the AVs just to add the multi-AV capability. It doesn't. It's not that difficult.
And one of the benefits for multi-AV is really that if you looked at a Venn diagram of which threats are detected by each AV engine, there's not always a whole lot of overlap. So by being able to look at multiple target spaces and multiple potential threats, that does get you a bit more coverage. And I know that's why that was part of the regulation to start with. Was to have the multi-AV engine. So that is something that we'll have coming up. One of the other features that I mentioned earlier was the behavior-based alerts, and that's particularly new. The older versions of XDR were protected against bad USB-type threats because of the minimal design approach that we take in the stripped-down base platform. But the newer capability is being able to alert based on that sort of behavior and show if a device has started acting in a way you wouldn't expect for a normal storage device. That can be flagged, that can be brought to the user's attention and logged for posterity, and that device can then be added to the quarantine stack.
Which AV are we using?
So the two in use on the upcoming version are Clam AV and Sophos.
Which we vetted through a very interesting community of interest on what was the best, and those were kind of recommended.
Yeah, we got a lot of input on that decision from different customers about what their preferences were to make that selection. One of the questions I had was about the zero-day threat protection, and really we're talking about the known good analysis when we talk about preventing against zero-day, because if you have a format, especially something that's supposed to be a data format that's structured, and you can analyze that structure and look at every subcomponent of that structure and verify that it conforms with the specification, then you can provide that sort of protection. You can strip out anything that doesn't comply. One of the common examples for this is the fact that there's some overlap, and some specifications have gray area where they have some metadata fields that you can add in just whatever you feel like sort of information, and sometimes those are unbounded. So you can end up with a file that has a .pdf extension that you can open as a zip file, or vice versa. And you can have these files that manage to actually conform to two specifications at the same time because of the sort of gray areas that have been defined in those specs. But by analyzing those and by figuring out where those areas are at, you can strip out any sort of malicious content. And you can just, you can get it down to just what's supposed to be in there.
So to clarify that a little bit, I mean, AV strips out things and so forth. But in known good, what we're looking for is a comparison to the structure, the defined design structure of the files. It's not based on properties or behaviors of the files. So if a certain macro, we don't strip out all macros, we only strip out those that could potentially be dangerous. They might not be dangerous at all, but if they have the structures or they're including properties that are potentially dangerous, then those are removed. So it's a different approach than the known bad. You're trying to essentially show that the file is of a certain structure and that it's not deviated from that structure, or it's using components of that file type or that specification that could potentially be dangerous. And that's the approach it's taking. There are no updates, or very few updates. The only updates you get for known good are when you have a file type change. So it's not the daily update issues that you have with known bad. Really, only updates occur when a company updates their file format. Does that make sense, or do you have anything to clarify to simplify that?
And I hope that clarifies a bit of what we're talking about for those sort of threats.
And it's unique. This product is unique in doing that.
And one of the other questions we had was about AV updates. So the AV updates come from those upstream vendors.
Right.
And there's a process within the administrative area to be able to update those.
Which is no different from any other AV server, AV product. I mean, we do that the same way.
Yes, and one of the interesting points that we have run into is that not all AV vendors follow best security practices in signing their AV updates.
Yeah.
So when possible, we use the vendor's signed updates.
Right.
If a vendor provides unsigned updates, then what we'll do is have our own signature that we can add on to that, so we can at least verify the hash and provide some additional assurance.
That's one of those exciting updates that we have.
Yeah, so
that was kind of new.
That's one of the up and comings.
Yeah.
But this is one of those things where all of these best practices aren't even in full adoption within the security community. So this is
we do see a lot of issues with commercial products. I mean, we do, as we said, OS work and security work for other products and companies, and it's a struggle. There's a lot of openness out there. Go ahead.
So one of the questions we just got was about firmware protection. So part of this involves practice as well. Really what you want is to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that you have input-output isolation. So even if some sort of bad USB device comes in on the input side,
the hardware itself,
it can't bypass any of the checks, any of the known good, any of the AV checking, and be able to try to write content or modify the output side directly to circumvent the scanning process. As for the devices on the output side, as part of the regulation required implementation, you end up having to have a controlled inventory of USB devices for use with CDAs. And for that controlled inventory, we have recommendations for vendors where you can get devices that are not susceptible to bad USB type threats, at which point you're trusting supply chain from those vendors. But there are some very good vendors out there who have been vetted by a lot of security groups to provide that sort of assurance. One of the links up here for the blog is actually to the bad USB post that I put up. And the main vector for being able to infect a USB device and infect that firmware is that the device has field updatable firmware. There are many devices out there that do. However, you can purchase devices which simply have flashed in firmware that can't be corrupted in the field. And at that point, the only possible vector is through supply chain from that drive vendor, it can't be corrupted, and it can't be maliciously altered in the field.
So the issue is that, you know, while our device will protect you against anything transferred from it, from a bad PMD or USB device, you know, that device, you don't want that in your population because it's not going to clear it. You know, we just ignore basically the firmware and hardware issues and just take the content. And that's how we provide the security.
I wouldn't say ignore, because we do have the behavioral. So if something malicious is detected in that firmware, the behavior seems suspicious, we'll alert on that so the drive can be quarantined. But nothing from that firmware ends up on the output side. Like Charlie said, all of that gets completely stripped out, and you just get the data through to the output side. There are a couple of questions in here about costs and selling. So Charlie, if you want to take a quick look at those.
So an XDR single, which one is it?
There's a question about AV updates and getting those.
The updates are bundled with, they come with the product. I mean, they are licensed inside our product. So you just hook up and get those updates. And they are from a single site, the vendor. That's a typical way. Obviously, you know, you can't hook although the device is capable of doing it and it's switch configurable, present regulation doesn't allow the device to be hooked up for automated updates. You got to do it manually, and that's the same with any device. These boundary devices cannot be, by regulation, connected to the net. So yeah, the updates are just like what you're getting now. There's no change in that process. You go to the vendor, you hit their site, and download. Do we sell a complete package with Linux, XDR loaded? Yeah, it's actually, XDR is an embedded device. It's you know, what Francisco was describing. It's Linux, but it's really small. There's not much that exists. I think it's down to 5% of the original footprint of Linux. It's wrapped into the product. So XDR, the application level or layer stuff, and all the I/O is really just one system. It's an embedded device. It's dedicated to this, and that's where we get a lot of protection because we're removing the surface area, all of the extraneous services and I/Os and ports and applications and stuff that could potentially, you know, act as a vector in the future. So it's a very stripped down OS. It is designed just to perform this function. It's essentially an embedded device in a laptop, which will look in a device that looks like a laptop. The software itself is very small and tight. So are there any others? Some other common questions are some things that I think are useful. Or, you know, years ago we would always have a difference, it seemed, between the vulnerabilities or the threats between industries, between government, military, and industry. You know, and Francisco, I wanted to ask you is, you know, do you see any difference now in the threats? You know, we just had the Sony attack. You know, North Korea got angry with Sony for, you know, for a movie they're going to put out about the leader, and so you're getting nation-state attacks on media companies because of, you know, their content. So, you know, I guess the question is, I don't know if there's any, if there is a question anymore. What is it that, you know, you're seeing as attacks? We do a lot of this, you know, IA defensive work. In conjunction, you know, against the IO guys, the offensive side, you know, all these, you know, kids and governments that are trying to produce these things, and those are the other side of the coin that we're always competing against. But what do you see?
So really, at this point, from my perspective, that sort of targeted threat, that sort of design threat, is present, and that must be accounted for. And this is something that's, you've seen it from the top down. This is why the DBT is defined. This is where this is coming in from. the threat is there and the targeted threat is there. Now, one of the interesting sides is that you're also getting that sort of push from the government side. That's part of the whole need to share movement that they've done in recent years. And they're trying to make outreach to critical infrastructure to be able to.
Well, these guys live on the ICS working group and all this.
So it's
like government stuff. But
that's. I'm simply saying from both sides, there seems to be an increased awareness and an increased recognition that this sort of targeted design basis threat is present, is real. And in terms of the methods used, this stuff's spreading quicker than it ever did before. I mean,
it's accelerating.
For the bad USB threat specifically, that initial group that gave the Black Hat talk didn't publish their exploit. They wanted to give, the vendors a chance to react. So they simply said, this vector is out there. We're not going to publish an example. And within, I want to say it was 3 weeks, another group had already published and said, here's an example exploit that we figured out just by knowing that it was there and that we could look for it. Here are the devices it works on. Here are the files you can download to be able to use this. And that's a group that's going public. That's not one of the groups that's keeping it to themselves and planning on doing anything malicious with it. Those are researchers. So the lag time between awareness of a new threat vector and people being able to have their hands on usable code is really almost disappeared.
I guess I could back that up. I mean, I had somebody mention that they weren't concerned about hardware or firmware-based attacks, and this was just before bad USB. And they said because it hadn't, reached the wild, it was all conjecture and academic. And I think, what's different about our product and our approach is it's really built ground up. It's built in anticipation of the hardware threat. Once the bad USB hit the street, we got a lot of phone calls from folks that said, hey, am I protected from this? And we could say with assurance that, yeah, you are, because we know that the device will not accept the firmware modifications that were deployed. So it makes you feel a bit more confident when you're built up like this and into a reduced instruction set, into a complete full scope, as you say, a full spectrum approach to this.
And that's what the regulations refer to as the adequate protection. You can't aim for that low bar. You've really got to aim for the highest bar. And be able to use the AV as a fallback to be able to provide adequate protection. And by having a very secure platform to perform that sort of inspection on, you end up providing high assurance of adequate protection. It's one of the contributions I've gotten in the questions for getting some exact language citation, which I appreciate.
So is there anything else? We're running on how long here?
So we've been almost an hour, and that was the last of the questions we had in the QA section of the WebEx. So if we can skip down.
If you guys have any questions, I think we respond very quickly, and we're very concerned about our work here with this within nuclear. We're growing quite well in the market here. I think people are beginning to realize, the quality of what we're doing, and also the magnitude of the attacks, the scope and scale of these attacks lately. I think highlights that you can't. This isn't lightweight protection time. We need to provide the real thing. You'll also find that the cost of the product is very reasonable, and that shouldn't be preventive. We can always talk to that also. So again, if you have any questions further, feel free to contact me. You'll see us again at NEI if I don't see you sooner. Francisco's going to be the technical lead. Donna's on the business side, and I'm kind of hovering over overall. Do you have more?
And yeah, just wanted to give a quick reminder. As we mentioned, we did a recording of this webinar.
Right.
So if you want to pass it along to anybody else in your organization, we'll be doing a review, make sure all the sound and everything's good, do our, do our last checks, and then we'll get that posted up, and Charlie will send you a link to that when it's available.
Right, and we're also, if you're interested in hearing this again or having us do a private call, that's certainly doable too. We're probably going to have a follow-on just due to the holiday season and so forth, but we had a good, strong turnout today, and we want to thank you for coming. So with that, I think if there's no more questions, does anybody have any more? One last look.
Oh, sorry, there was one last question in there about support for encrypted removable devices.
We do have support. It's the Iron Key. There were two, right?
Yeah.
Iron Key and
the Kangaroo.
Kangaroo, yeah, which is the one we kind of liked. They had a nice.
Yeah, we've had Iron Key support for quite a while. The Kangaroo are a newer line that are also FIPS 140-2 compliant devices.
Yeah, they're kind of good-looking devices. We worked with them a little bit. Some of our product team did some research and screened them. I think they're mentioned they are definitely mentioned in the bad USB document. If you go back one.
Yep, and we had one last question as well about where these are currently being used. Are they currently in plants?
Yeah, they are. We are. They've passed audit in I don't know how many facilities. And it's been a good response. There were a couple of hiccups because it was a new in some regions where it was sort of a new device and the audit team wasn't quite familiar with it. But we support with the body of evidence. We have wheelbarrows full of government grade certification information and all that good stuff, and description. We help with the procedures and policies also. There are also some third-party vendors, Wiz Nucleus and so forth, are familiar with our product, and those guys, if you're working with them, know how to deploy it and develop policies and procedures. So the documents that we have are sort of a generic version. Those web links are generic template, let's call it. It's not going to be your procedure in a final form, but it has the highlights of what you need to address, and then you can apply it and tailor it to your facility. But you'll get the overview and it's built on successful audit and successful. It's one thing to be audited, but it's more important to be protected, and it's built on best practices that have passed audit also.
Yep. And I should also say that we are very quick to respond if you're undergoing an inspection and if there are questions that weren't covered in any of the documentation that you have available. We're very quick to respond. I'm sure Charlie can tell you. He gets those emails, Donna gets those emails. Yep. So
it's all part of supporting the product in this environment, and we're very comfortable with that. So do you have any I
No, those were a couple of the ones that came in at the last minute.
They really
Thank you for the questions, everybody.
Yeah. I was going to say in terms of the market coverage, I think we're probably in the 40% range of sites, something like that. There's a lot going on, and certainly the ones that are using digital, more digital systems, are very heavy users. So there's a bit more reliant on that. And I guess again, if you have any questions, no hesitation. We'll be more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, you all.
Thanks, everybody.